A former Viet Cong fighter sat across from a Vietnamese journalist in 1986 and said something that contradicted everything Hanoi had spent 2 decades telling the world about the war. She said they were not afraid of the American GIs. She said they were not afraid of the Australian infantry. She said they were not even afraid of the B-52 bombers that turned entire grid squares into moonscapes. Then her voice dropped, and her expression changed entirely. She said they hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they made comrades disappear. Not killed, not wounded, not captured, disappear. As if the jungle itself had opened up and swallowed them without sound or explanation. And she was not alone. Across thousands of pages of captured enemy documents, interrogation transcripts, and post-war Vietnamese military histories, a pattern emerges that the Pentagon never wanted anyone to examine too closely. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army developed an entirely separate tactical language to describe the Australians. They studied them differently. They briefed against them differently. They feared them differently. And in a war where the most powerful military on earth could not prevent its patrols from being ambushed with devastating regularity, somewhere between 120 and 150 Australians at any given time achieved something that 500,000 Americans could not. They became invisible. They became the thing the enemy could not find, could not track, could not predict, and could not fight. The NVA called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, ghosts, and the story of how they earned that name is not a story about bravery or firepower or technological superiority. It is a story about what happens when you stop trying to dominate the jungle and start trying to become part of it. But to understand why the enemy spoke of them in terms usually reserved for folklore and superstition, we need to start with the province where the haunting began. Phuoc Tuy province sits roughly 50 kilometers southeast of Saigon. In 1966, when the first Australian task force established its base at Nui Dat, the province was thoroughly controlled by the Viet Cong. 2 main force regiments operated within its borders. The 274th Regiment occupied the Hot Ditch Jungle in the northwest, a force of approximately 2,000 fighters organized into 3 battalions. The 275th Regiment operated from the Mae Tao Mountains in the northeast with similar strength, and linking them, operating with intimate knowledge of every village, every trail, every sympathetic household, was the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, roughly 350 fighters recruited from the local population at Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long. The Viet Cong had been building their infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy since the war against the French. They had fought in these jungles for a generation. They knew every stream crossing, every cave system, every route through the triple canopy forest. The province was their home. They collected taxes from its villages. They recruited from its families. They buried their dead in its soil. Their tunnel systems in the long high hills had been under construction for over 2 decades. Networks so deep and so well camouflaged that tens of thousands of tons of American bombs had failed to reach them. The Viet Cong held this ground with the certainty of people who had been fighting for it since before most of the soldiers opposing them had been born. Into this environment, in April 1966, the Australian government sent the first Australian task force, roughly 4,500 personnel, who established themselves at a base called Nui Dat, a low hill surrounded by rubber plantations in the heart of the province. The decision to give the Australians their own province was itself significant. Unlike the first Australian battalion that had arrived in 1965 and been attached to American forces at Bien Hoa, where the differences between Australian and American operational methods had generated constant friction. The task force at Nui Dat would operate with genuine tactical autonomy. The Australians had insisted on this. They would pacify Phuoc Tuy using their own methods, and those methods would differ from American doctrine in ways that would become the central story of their war. The American approach, as one Australian officer put it bluntly, relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition, which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The Australians emphasized deliberate patrolling using dispersed companies supported by artillery, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages while slowly extending government control. These were not merely different tactics. They were different philosophies of warfare applied to the same enemy in the same country. Among the roughly 4,500 personnel at Nui Dat, operating from a small compound on SAS Hill, was a single squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment, never more than 150 men in country at any given time. 3 Sabre squadrons rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments from 1966 to 1971, each completing 2 tours before the last was withdrawn in October 1971. Their official designation was reconnaissance. Their official mission was to serve as the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force, providing intelligence on enemy movements, positions, and intentions. Their actual effect on the war in Phuoc Tuy would be something no official designation could capture. The 1st SASR Squadron, 3 Squadron, arrived at Vung Tau in June 1966 and moved to Nui Dat the following day. Within their first week, each troop conducted 24-hour familiarization patrols of the area immediately surrounding the base. The first enemy contact came on the 25th of June, when 3 Squadron was fired upon by a Viet Cong group. It was an inauspicious beginning to what would become a 5-year campaign that transformed the entire security landscape of the province. By the end of June, as the Australian infantry began patrolling the area around the base, the SAS pushed further into the province. Their first long-range patrol penetrated the Nui Din Hills, 7 kilometers west of Nui Dat. By July, they were operating around Long Ton village and other areas deeper into Viet Cong territory. During those first 9 months, 3 Squadron conducted 134 patrols and developed many of the techniques that would be refined and perfected by subsequent squadrons. The broader context of the Australian Task Force's early months in Phuoc Tuy provided a dramatic backdrop to the SAS's quiet, methodical work. On the 18th of August, 1966, barely 2 months after the Australians had established themselves at Nui Dat, D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment walked into what would become the most famous Australian engagement of the entire war, the Battle of Long Tan. 108 Australian and New Zealand soldiers caught in a rubber plantation during a monsoon downpour were attacked by a combined Viet Cong force that included the D445 Battalion and elements of the 275 Theed Regiment, a force estimated at 1,500 to 2,000 fighters. In ankle-deep mud, with ammunition running low and radio communications disrupted by the storm, the Australians fought for hours with artillery fire directed to within 30 meters of their own positions. When armored personnel carriers finally broke through with reinforcements, 18 Australians were dead and 24 wounded. The Viet Cong left at least 245 dead on the field. Long Tan was significant for two reasons. First, it demonstrated that the Australians could survive a major engagement against overwhelming odds, and this display of combined arms capability gave the Viet Cong permanent pause about challenging the task force in conventional battle. Second, and more relevant to the SAS story, it highlighted the intelligence gap that had allowed such a large enemy force to concentrate undetected within striking distance of Nui Dat. SAS patrols had detected enemy activity east of the base in the weeks before the battle, but the full scope of the threat had not been understood in time. Long Tan became the defining argument for the expansion and prioritization of SAS reconnaissance operations. If the eyes and ears of the task force could prevent a concentration like that from happening again, every subsequent operation would be conducted from a position of greater knowledge and reduced vulnerability. The SASR's methods were forged long before Vietnam. The regiment had been modeled on the British SAS and established in 1957, initially as a company, before being expanded to a full regiment in August 1964. Based at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, a suburb of Perth in Western Australia, the unit drew from a selection process that was among the most demanding in the Western military world. Candidates were assessed not merely for physical endurance, but for a specific psychological profile: high tolerance for discomfort, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what evaluators termed predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless and alert for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training pipeline lasting 18 months, 3 times longer than American Special Forces training of the same era. But the regiment's operational character drew from something far older than any European military tradition. Australia had spent a century fighting what military historians call small wars: the Boer War in South Africa, where conventional British tactics proved catastrophic against mobile guerrilla fighters who knew the terrain; the campaign in Malaya during the 1950s emergency, where Commonwealth forces spent 12 years hunting communist insurgents through equatorial jungle so dense that patrols sometimes covered less than a kilometer in a full day; and the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo from 1963 to 1966, where SASR personnel conducted covert cross-border reconnaissance operations into Indonesian territory, operating in tiny patrols deep behind enemy lines in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. Each of these conflicts taught a particular lesson that American military culture had never absorbed. The lesson was that in jungle warfare, the patrol that moved fastest died first. The patrol that carried the most firepower attracted the most attention. The patrol that behaved like a conventional military force invited the conventional military response of ambush and annihilation. The Australians learned the opposite instinct. Small was better than large. Slow was better than fast. Patience was not the absence of action. It was the most lethal form of it. By the time the first SASR squadron deployed to Vietnam in mid-1966, this philosophy was embedded in every element of their operational doctrine. Patrols consisted of 5 men, occasionally 6 if a New Zealand SAS trooper was attached. Each patrol carried enough food, water, and ammunition to operate independently for days. They moved through the jungle at speeds that horrified American observers. Where American long-range reconnaissance patrols covered 2 to 3 kilometers per day, Australian SAS patrols sometimes moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. One step, then absolute stillness for minutes, eyes scanning, ears processing every sound the jungle produced, nostrils reading the air for human scent, for cooking fires, for the particular chemical signature of weapons oil or rice being prepared. Then another step? American personnel who witnessed this movement technique for the first time often assumed they were watching a demonstration rather than actual operational procedure. They could not reconcile the idea that an elite military unit would voluntarily move at a pace that meant covering a single kilometer could consume an entire day. It seemed not merely cautious, but operationally useless. What American observers failed to understand was what this speed made possible. At 100 meters per hour, a 5-man patrol produced no detectable sound. The jungle's ambient noise, its insects, its birds, its monkeys, recovered completely between each movement. To an enemy listening post trained to detect the rustling of vegetation, the snap of a twig, the subtle compression of leaf matter underfoot, an area where Australian SAS operated sounded indistinguishable from undisturbed forest. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to trigger the ambush drills that Viet Cong units had perfected against American patrols over years of practice. But silence was only part of the equation. The Australians also eliminated every other signature that might betray their presence. They stopped using commercial soap, deodorant, and insect repellent days before insertion. American hygiene products created chemical traces in the humid jungle air that enemy scouts could detect from considerable distances. Captured Viet Cong fighters confirmed during interrogations that American patrols could be smelled well before they could be seen. The Australians removed that vulnerability entirely. By the time they entered the jungle, their scent had merged with their surroundings. They camouflaged themselves with a thoroughness that went beyond face paint and foliage. They wrapped equipment to prevent any metallic sound. They taped down anything that could rattle or click. They wore soft-soled footwear designed to leave minimal tracks. Some accounts describe patrols using captured enemy sandals or modifying their boots to obscure the distinctive tread patterns that Viet Cong trackers had learned to recognize as Australian or American. The last man in a patrol would brush out tracks through muddy terrain using branches. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth whenever possible. They walked in stream beds when the terrain allowed, leaving no prints at all. The cumulative effect of these measures was something approaching tactical invisibility. And this was not a metaphorical description. It was a documented operational reality reflected in captured enemy documents that the Pentagon would eventually classify at the highest levels. The first significant indication that the enemy viewed the Australians as fundamentally different from American forces emerged from interrogation reports and captured Viet Cong documents beginning in late 1966 and continuing through the following years. The pattern was consistent and deeply uncomfortable for American military planners. In several communist military histories and tactical documents examined by researchers, Australian regular infantry battalion elements were consistently referred to as Viet Cong, the Vietnamese term for commandos or special forces. This was a revealing classification. The Viet Cong had extensive experience fighting American conventional infantry, and they categorized those forces accordingly. But Australian infantry, which routinely operated in section and half-platoon-sized patrols rather than the company or battalion strength formations favored by American doctrine, appeared to the enemy as something qualitatively different. The NVA and VC considered the Australian infantry to be elite commandos because of the small size and independent nature of their patrol elements compared to American forces that appeared to operate almost exclusively in large units. The SASR was classified in even more exceptional terms. The term applied to them, Ma Rung, carried connotations that went beyond military respect into something closer to superstition. In Vietnamese folklore, Ma Rung are forest spirits, entities that inhabit the deep jungle and operate according to rules that living men cannot comprehend. The fact that professional soldiers, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, applied this term to their enemies reveals the psychological impact the Australian SAS had achieved. The tactical documents captured from Viet Cong units contained explicit instructions regarding engagement with Australian forces that differed radically from the guidance issued for American contacts. Against Americans, the tactical doctrine emphasized aggression and predictability. American units were identified as following recognizable patterns. They inserted by helicopter, creating noise signatures detectable from great distances. They moved at speeds that left clear trails. Their movements could be anticipated based on established patterns of behavior, and their reliance on supporting fires created exploitable windows between the initiation of contact and the arrival of effective artillery or air support. The recommended approach for engaging American forces was straightforward: ambush at carefully selected locations, inflict maximum casualties in the opening seconds, withdraw through prepared routes before heavy weapons could be brought to bear, and reposition for subsequent engagements. For Australian forces and the SASR in particular, the guidance was fundamentally different. The primary recommendation was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because the Australians were more likely to detect the ambush before walking into it than to be surprised by it. Do not attempt pursuit, because Australian counter-tracking capabilities made such efforts futile and potentially fatal. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not known to be operating. These documents represented something extraordinary in the history of the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong were a fighting force that had defeated the French colonial army. They had fought the South Vietnamese military to a standstill across most of the country. They had developed tactics that consistently produced devastating results against the most powerful military on Earth. They were not a force prone to timidity or excessive caution. And yet, when it came to fewer than 150 Australian SAS personnel operating in Phuoc Tuy province, their official guidance amounted to a single strategic recommendation: stay away. The fear was not abstract. It had measurable tactical consequences that unfolded across the province over years. Enemy activity in areas where Australian SAS patrols operated was consistently and measurably lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that conducted aggressive offensive operations against American forces in one area would refuse to enter Australian territory in a neighboring sector. When main force units did move through Phuoc Tuy, their behavior changed visibly, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. One of the primary mechanisms through which the SAS generated this fear was their ambush doctrine. Unlike American tactics that emphasized finding the enemy and bringing overwhelming firepower to bear, the Australian SAS reversed the dynamic. They became the ambush force. 5 men would insert into enemy territory, move to a position along a known Viet Cong route, and wait, not for hours, for days. They would lie concealed in vegetation so dense that enemy fighters could pass within meters without detecting them. They would remain motionless for periods that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, monitoring enemy movement patterns, counting personnel, documenting schedules and routes. And then, when the moment was right, they would strike. The contact would be devastating and brief. Claymore mines detonated by electrical command, automatic weapons firing at ranges so close, the engagement was over before the enemy could process what was happening. The Australians would unleash a volume of fire designed to simulate a force many times their actual size, a technique that exploited a fundamental human response. An enemy soldier under fire instinctively estimates the size of the opposing force by the volume and spread of incoming rounds. 5 Australians firing everything they carried could sound like a platoon. They sometimes even modified their weapons to imitate the distinctive sound signatures of heavier weapon systems. And before the enemy could organize a response, the patrol would be gone, withdrawn along a pre-planned route to an extraction point, or melted back into the jungle to establish a new position and repeat the process. The aftermath of these contacts was carefully managed for maximum psychological effect. Bodies were sometimes arranged in positions calculated to unsettle whoever found them. Playing cards, specifically the ace of spades, which carried powerful death-associated superstitions in Vietnamese culture, were left as calling cards. In some instances, the SASR would infiltrate enemy positions at night without engaging, leaving behind evidence of their presence designed to demonstrate that they had been inside the perimeter while everyone slept. Footprints that appeared from nowhere and led to nothing. Equipment subtly rearranged. Messages scratched into tree bark. The intention was not merely to kill the enemy, but to communicate with the survivors, to send the message that no position was secure, that the ghosts could reach you anywhere. American observers were divided on these methods. Some recognized their devastating effectiveness. Others found them uncomfortably close to psychological operations that pushed the boundaries of conventional military conduct. But none could dispute the results. The SASR was not simply killing enemy fighters. They were waging a deliberate campaign of psychological degradation that eroded unit cohesion more effectively than any amount of conventional attrition. The psychological toll of this approach on enemy forces compounded over months and years. For Viet Cong fighters in Phuoc Tuy, there was no pattern to the attacks, no predictability, no way to establish where the Australians were or when they would strike next. Patrols that had moved safely along established routes for years suddenly became death traps. Supply parties vanished. Courier teams failed to arrive. Sentries were found dead at their posts, without adjacent positions hearing a sound. Political officers, the cadre responsible for maintaining ideological commitment and unit morale, reported increasing difficulty keeping their soldiers motivated in areas where the phantoms operated. Desertion rates climbed. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Some units began conducting elaborate spiritual rituals before entering jungle zones associated with the Ma Rung. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, which had operated with relative impunity in Phuoc Tuy for years before the Australians arrived, experienced a progressive degradation in capability that went beyond physical attrition. The long high hills, a range of jungle-covered limestone formations rising from the coastal plains southeast of Nui Dat, had served as one of D445's primary strongholds. The hills contained a network of caves, underground rivers, and tunnel complexes that had been under construction and expansion for more than 2 decades. The Viet Cong had not merely dug into these mountains, they had made themselves part of the geological structure, with facilities that included field hospitals, weapons caches, and political training centers, all protected by depths of rock that rendered even B-52 bombardment ineffective. American forces had tried to penetrate the long, high hills. The results had been grim. Operations into the area by conventional infantry produced casualties that persuaded MACV Command to restrict further ground operations. The terrain favored the defenders absolutely. Every approach could be covered. Every withdrawal route led through killing zones. The Viet Cong knew every meter of the ground. The Australians approached the long, high hills differently. Rather than attempting to seize or clear the complex in a single decisive operation, they inserted SAS patrols into the area for extended periods to map the entire system. Every entrance, every exit, every supply route, every pattern of human movement in and out of the cave networks. The intelligence they gathered over months filled thousands of pages of classified reports and provided the foundation for a series of targeted operations that progressively degraded D445's ability to use the long, high hills as a sanctuary. The final major operation in the area, Operation Hammersley in February 1970, forced D445 to effectively withdraw from the hills. D445's operational logs from 1968 and 1969 recorded incidents that suggest a unit sliding into collective anxiety. Personnel failed to return from routine water collection, and no evidence of contact could be found. Sentries reported presences in the jungle at night that flare illumination revealed nothing to explain. Commanders restricted movement to daylight hours. Requests for reinforcement were submitted to higher headquarters. In December 1969, the battalion suffered another devastating blow when Australian forces, guided by intelligence gathered by SAS patrols, discovered and destroyed the Mae Tau mountain base, including D445's field hospital and pharmacy. The Australian SAS did not need to destroy D445 battalion through conventional military attrition. They did something more effective. They made the jungle itself feel dangerous to the people who had lived in it their entire lives. The Viet Cong, who had used the forests and mountains of Phuoc Tuy as their sanctuary, their refuge, their greatest tactical advantage, began to experience those same environments as hostile. The hunters became the hunted, and they knew it, and the knowledge ate at their effectiveness like acid. By the end of 1968, D445 Battalion had effectively ceased aggressive offensive operations in areas where the SASR was known to patrol. Their fighting strength had not been decisively reduced. Their weapons were functional. Their supplies, while under pressure from the broader Australian interdiction campaign, remained adequate for continued operations. But their will to operate aggressively had been broken by an enemy they could not find, could not predict, and could not meaningfully engage. The unit that had attacked the Australians at Long Tan in regimental strength in August 1966, that had launched coordinated assaults on regional force outposts with confidence and initiative, was reduced to defensive operations and reluctant patrolling in its own territory. The statistics bear out the scale of what the SASR achieved. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols across Phuoc Tuy and adjacent provinces. Those patrols resulted in at least 492 confirmed enemy killed, with an additional 106 assessed as probably killed. They captured 11 prisoners and wounded at least 47 more. Against these numbers, the SASR's own casualties were staggeringly low. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 soldier missing in action, whose remains would not be recovered until 2008 after he fell into the jungle during a rope extraction. 28 men were wounded. During the entire period of SASR deployment, 580 men served in Vietnam with the regiment. These figures represented the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam and one of the highest of the entire war by any Allied force. The numbers were so asymmetrical that they invited skepticism from American analysts who initially suspected the Australians were either avoiding contact to keep their figures clean or inflating their results. The captured enemy documents eliminated both possibilities. The enemy confirmed the effectiveness themselves. What made the SASR's impact even more remarkable was that their primary mission was not killing. It was intelligence gathering. The regiment served as the principal reconnaissance asset for the entire 1st Australian Task Force. SAS patrols located enemy base camps and supply routes. They monitored Viet Cong movements. They identified the positions of tunnel complexes, weapons caches, and headquarters elements. They reported enemy strength, disposition, and intentions, often spending days in concealed positions within hundreds of meters of major Viet Cong installations, counting fighters, documenting routines, and transmitting intelligence that enabled larger Australian infantry operations. The success of major Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy was repeatedly linked directly to intelligence gathered by SAS patrols. When 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and New Zealand forces mounted a month-long operation to clear the Mai Tao Mountains in late 1969. The intelligence that made the operation possible had been gathered by SAS reconnaissance patrols over preceding weeks. They had penetrated into areas that were considered Viet Cong strongholds, terrain that was beyond artillery and mortar range of Nui Dat, and returned with detailed information about enemy routes, positions, and capabilities. The SASR also provided instructors to the American MACV Recondo School, where their methods were taught to American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel. Beginning in 1967, SASR instructors also worked at the Van Keep Training Center through the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. Some individual SASR members served on exchange with American Special Forces units and with the highly classified MACVSOG, the Studies and Observations Group that ran covert operations across the borders into Laos and Cambodia. In every context where American and Australian Special Operations personnel worked together, the assessment was the same. American Special Operations soldiers who trained alongside the Australians consistently praised their fieldcraft as the most advanced they had encountered. One Navy SEAL who spent time attached to Australian patrols later stated that he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australians than he had learned in any American training program, including Army Ranger School and Raider School. He noted that the Australian fieldcraft capabilities were so superior that the comparison was humbling, and that American forces lost personnel specifically because they lacked the field skills the Australians had mastered. The SEALs of that era, he admitted, simply did not have the jungle craft required for the operations they were conducting. American personnel from the 101st Airborne Division participated in joint patrols with the SASR during 1967, and these exchanges consistently produced the same assessment. The Australians operated at a level of stealth and environmental awareness that American training had not prepared their soldiers to match. The difference was not in courage or physical capability. It was in a fundamental approach to the jungle environment that American doctrine had never cultivated. But the enemy also adapted to the SASR over time, and this adaptation tells its own story about the respect the Viet Cong developed for their adversary. By 1970, after 5 years of SAS patrolling, the Viet Cong had finally become familiar enough with SASR helicopter insertion techniques that it was not unusual for Australians to be fired upon shortly after landing in an area. The enemy had learned to identify the distinctive sound of helicopter insertions that delivered 5-man teams rather than full infantry companies, and they began positioning ambush teams near suspected landing zones. The Australians adapted in turn, developing what they called cowboy insertions, in which the helicopter carrying the patrol was followed by a second helicopter with a backup patrol. Both patrols would insert and travel together for 5 minutes. The second patrol would then stop, wait, and return to the landing zone for extraction, while the first continued its mission. If there was no contact, the second team withdrew. If the landing zone was hot, both teams provided mutual support. This constant innovation, this refusal to allow any technique to become predictable, was central to the SASR's sustained effectiveness. This brings us to what was perhaps the most important and least understood aspect of the SASR's effectiveness in Vietnam, the philosophical foundation that underpinned their operational doctrine. The American military of the 1960s was built on principles that had proven devastatingly effective in conventional warfare: speed, aggression, overwhelming firepower, technological superiority. These principles had won the Second World War. They had held the line in Korea. They had made the United States the dominant military power on Earth. When applied to the jungles of Southeast Asia, they failed, not partially. Not in edge cases, they failed systematically, producing predictable patterns that the enemy exploited with increasing sophistication over years. The American commander David Hackworth, one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam era, recognized this failure and later wrote extensively about Australian methods. His observation captured the essential difference in a single sentence. The Australians used squads to make contact and then brought in reinforcements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could accomplish anything. This was the inversion of American doctrine in miniature. Americans concentrated force first and then sought contact. Australians found the enemy first with small elements, then applied force with precision. The Australian approach inverted American assumptions at every level. Where American doctrine said move fast, Australian doctrine said move slowly enough that movement itself becomes undetectable. Where American doctrine said bring firepower, Australian doctrine said bring patience. Where American doctrine said dominate the environment, Australian doctrine said become part of it. Where American doctrine treated the jungle as an obstacle to be overcome through technology and force, Australian doctrine treated it as a medium to be inhabited and mastered. The Malayan emergency had been the critical proving ground for this philosophy. In 12 years of counterinsurgency against communist guerrillas in the jungles of the Malay Peninsula, the British and Commonwealth forces had learned lessons that no amount of theory could replace. They learned that a guerrilla could only be defeated by methods more patient, more disciplined, and more adapted to the environment than those the guerrilla himself employed. They learned that small patrols moving silently through deep jungle could achieve intelligence results that no technology could replicate. They learned that the population was the prize, not the enemy's body count. The Australians absorbed these lessons into their institutional memory and carried them to Vietnam. The Americans, who had not fought in Malaya, arrived in Southeast Asia with doctrines developed in the very different theaters of Europe and the Pacific, where massed firepower and industrial superiority had been the deciding factors. This inversion produced results that the numbers only partially capture. The most important effect was psychological. The Australians had achieved something that no amount of bombing, no number of sweep and clear operations, no quantity of helicopter assaults had accomplished. They had made the Viet Cong afraid of the jungle. The very terrain that had been the foundation of Viet Cong military strategy, the dense forests and mountain caves that sheltered them from aerial observation and conventional ground assault, had been turned into a source of vulnerability. The jungle was no longer the Viet Cong's sanctuary. It was the place where the ghosts lived. Former Viet Cong leaders confirmed this assessment in post-war interviews and writings. One captured sentiment, repeated in various forms across multiple accounts, conveyed the distinction starkly. The Americans could be fought because they were predictable. They relied on their machines and their firepower, and once you understood their patterns, you could avoid the worst of what they could deliver. The Australians were different. The Australians were worse than the Americans. The American approach was to hit, then call for planes and artillery. The Australian approach was to use small units to make contact, then bring in reinforcements for the killing. They planned with the understanding that a platoon on the ground could accomplish anything. By 1971, when the last Australian SAS squadron departed Vietnam, the cumulative effect of 5 years of continuous SASR operations was reflected in the state of the province they had been assigned to secure. Phuoc Tuy had been progressively brought under Australian control through a sustained counterinsurgency campaign that combined SAS intelligence gathering with conventional infantry operations, civic action programs, and a strategy of disrupting enemy food supplies and logistics. The D445 Battalion, which had been a formidable fighting force when the Australians arrived, had been forced out of the province and relied on North Vietnamese reinforcements to maintain even reduced capability. Highway 15 between Saigon and Vung Tau, which had been a death trap for Allied convoys in 1966, was open to unescorted civilian traffic. The enemy's capacity for large-scale offensive action in the province had been effectively neutralized. The SASR's contribution to this outcome was disproportionate to their numbers by any reasonable measure. A rotating force of 150 men had provided the intelligence foundation for an entire task force's operations across 5 years. They had conducted 1,200 patrols. They had surveilled thousands of enemy combatants. They had killed or captured over 500 enemy personnel while suffering a handful of casualties. They had degraded enemy morale to a degree that B-52 strikes could not match. But the story of the Ma Rung does not end with statistics or tactical assessments. There is a dimension to this history that the numbers cannot capture, and that military analysts tend to overlook, and it concerns what it cost to become what the jungle demanded. The men who served in the SASR in Vietnam underwent a transformation that was not simply professional. It was psychological and, in ways that would only become fully apparent decades later, existential. Operating for days and weeks in enemy territory at the intensity required by SAS patrol doctrine demanded a recalibration of human awareness that did not easily reverse. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in the jungle, the suppression of normal human behavioral patterns that made them undetectable to the enemy, the capacity for explosive violence after hours or days of absolute stillness. These were adaptations that served survival in the field, but created complications when their practitioners returned to civilian life. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually be documented at levels that exceeded what their relatively low casualty figures might suggest. The same transformation that made SASR operators devastatingly effective in the jungle, the ability to suppress normal emotional responses, to exist in a state of predatory awareness for extended periods, to function in isolation from human connection, created patterns that did not resolve when the deployment ended. Some veterans described the sensation of having become something other than a conventional soldier, something closer to an animal adapted to a specific environment. Returning to the noise and chaos of civilian life after weeks of existing in absolute silence felt not like a homecoming, but like a displacement. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, ghosts, but a ghost is a creature caught between worlds, neither fully present in the realm of the living nor able to pass completely to whatever lies beyond. For some of the men who mastered the techniques that earned them that name, the description proved more accurate than anyone intended. They had crossed into a way of being that the jungle demanded, and some never fully crossed back. This is the truth that heroic narratives about military effectiveness tend to omit. The SASR's achievements in Vietnam were genuine. Their methods represented real advances in the art of unconventional warfare that continue to influence special operations doctrine worldwide. Modern American Special Forces training, from Fort Liberty to Coronado, incorporates principles that the Australians demonstrated were effective in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy more than 50 years ago. Small unit tactics, environmental adaptation, patience as a weapon, stealth over firepower. These concepts, available for learning in 1966, took the American military decades to fully absorb, but effectiveness was purchased at prices that extended far beyond the battlefield. The capacity to hunt human beings in their own environment, to move among them unseen, to strike without warning and disappear without trace, required becoming something that civilian society had no framework to accommodate. The skills that made the Ma Rung lethal in the jungle did not translate into capabilities that a suburban neighborhood or a factory floor or a marriage could use. The silence that made them invisible in the triple canopy became an inability to communicate in ordinary conversation. The hyper-awareness that detected an enemy footstep at 50 meters became an inability to sit in a crowded room without mapping every exit and evaluating every stranger as a potential threat. Approximately 580 men served with the SASR in Vietnam. Many returned and lived full, productive lives. Others struggled with the consequences of what they had learned to be. The Australian government would spend decades grappling with the legacy of their service, initially through denial, and then through programs that often fell short of addressing the specific character of what SAS veterans had experienced. The last Australian combat troops left Vietnam in late 1971, and the final elements withdrew by 1973. The war they left behind would grind on for another 2 years before Saigon fell in April 1975. The province they had spent 5 years securing, Phuoc Tuy, would fall back under communist control, along with the rest of South Vietnam. The tactical success they achieved would be rendered strategically meaningless by the broader failure of the Allied war effort. This was the final, bitter irony. Everything the Australians accomplished in Phuoc Tuy, the painstaking intelligence gathering, the degradation of enemy forces, the progressive extension of government control, all of it proved to be a masterful solution to a problem that could not be solved at the provincial level. But the operational lessons endured, and they endured precisely because they were proven against an enemy that had defeated every other approach. In the decades following Vietnam, the Australian SAS experience became required study material at military academies around the world. The tracker programs, the long-range patrol doctrine, the principle that small, highly skilled units operating with patience and environmental awareness could achieve results that technology and firepower could not replicate. These concepts were absorbed into the training curricula at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, and at the Naval Special Warfare Center at Coronado. They influenced the development of American Delta Force and the expansion of the SEAL teams. They contributed to a broader revolution in special operations, thinking that would reshape how the world's military powers approached unconventional warfare. And yet, the legacy endures beyond doctrine and training manuals. In the annals of unconventional warfare, the Australian SAS in Vietnam stands as one of the most striking demonstrations of what small, highly trained units can achieve when they are allowed to operate according to principles suited to their environment rather than principles imported from a different kind of war. 1,200 patrols, over 500 enemy killed, a handful of casualties, an entire enemy force structure rendered psychologically incapable of operating in its own territory, all accomplished by a rotating force that never exceeded 150 men at any given time, in a war that consumed 500,000 American troops. The Viet Cong gave them the name that history remembers: Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. It was meant as a description of something they could not comprehend: soldiers who moved without sound, soldiers who struck without warning, soldiers who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, present in every shadow and absent from every search. The name was born from fear, from the experience of fighting an enemy that could not be located by the same methods that had served the Viet Cong against every other Western force they had encountered. But the name carried more truth than the Viet Cong knew. Ghosts are not just invisible. They are defined by what they have left behind, by the world they inhabited before they crossed into whatever place they now occupy. The men of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment left behind the assumptions of conventional warfare. They left behind the comforts of standard military life. They left behind, in some cases, the version of themselves that had existed before the jungle reshaped them. What they brought back was a record of operational achievement that has rarely been matched in the history of modern warfare. What they left in the jungle was something more personal and more costly, a piece of themselves that stayed in the silence between the trees, in the stillness between one step and the next, in the long minutes of frozen awareness when the entire world contracted to the sounds and smells and shifting shadows of a hostile forest that they had learned to inhabit better than the people who called it home. The enemy spent years trying to describe them. They used every tool available: tactical analysis, intelligence reports, operational guidance, even the language of folklore and supernatural dread. In the end, the most honest description came not from military professionals, but from the simple vocabulary of people confronted with something they could not explain. They were everywhere, they were nowhere, they were ghosts, and no amount of searching ever found them.